Thank you, Neha. Let us pray. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight. Amen. Thanks to Neha for reading Ziggurat instead of Tower. I had asked her to do that. Anyway, if you haven't listened to or watched last week's sermon, you may be kind of lost in some parts today. This is supposed to be a series. It's going to build on each other. So if you don't understand things today, I request you to watch last week's sermon and then watch this week's sermon again so that things may make sense. And then for next week, watch both the sermons. Yeah? They're all going to keep building up. Yeah. And given the trend here, I think the sermons are just going to get longer and longer. Anyway, unlike me, my mother has a green thumb. Make that 2 green thumbs. She has a wide variety of plants at her home, and she knows exactly what conditions are needed for each of them to thrive. Some are sturdy, and they can thrive in a wide variety of conditions. Most, however, are quite finicky. The most finicky of these are the orchids. Now, I've never had much interest in plants. However, when I found her moving one of the plants every night into the bathroom so that it could be in complete darkness, I was intrigued. She'd bring it out in the morning, in the night it would go back, and like, what is going on? So what is it that caused these plants to become so finicky? She then told me what the natural habitat of these plants was. As you know, I didn't care much about plants, so I didn't bother. But she told me about this. Most of them have evolved to thrive under very specific circumstances, conditions. They're normally latched onto the bark of some plant. Now, they don't harm the host plant, but use its features to obtain a safe environment in which to thrive. Since they grow under the shade of this host plant, the conditions they experience are very, very specific. No direct sunlight, no direct rain, no harsh winds, high humidity, etc., etc. And because these conditions are so specific, when we try to grow them in our gardens, we are stuck with a very finicky plant. What I learned from the orchids is that the untested tree has not any strength because it is the test that produces strength. Similarly, an untested human knows not his or her strength because it is the test that produces strength. Last Sunday, when we began this series, I insisted that humans were created to experience a prolonged period of apprenticeship under God, during which they learned how to make the garden flourish so that they could make the rest of the world flourish. But also I claimed that God's final goal was to make his home with his creatures, requiring that nothing would enter into the new creation that could in any way undermine God's purposes for it. This required that the humans would be tested. The testing is like what we do with the metal in a fire. The fire reveals what the metal is and whether or not it contains impurities. This allows the smith to subject the metal to further purification conditions so that in the end, only the pure metal remains. Without testing, we would have an impure metal with all its flaws, all its imperfections. The human story in the Bible begins with 2 accounts of creation in Genesis 1 and 2, as we saw last week. In Genesis 3 to 11, we are introduced to the problems resulting from the testing of the humans. What we see in the 3 texts that we heard today are the accounts of 3 lenses that focus the ways in which humans failed when tested. Each of these accounts focuses on one aspect of testing. And when humans fail in that aspect, the kind of character flaws that God needs to fix in us before we can safely enter the new creation are revealed. It is crucial that we understand this. I am a teacher. When I administer the test, the primary goal is not to find whether the students will pass or fail. That's not the goal for a teacher. An observant teacher actually knows all this in advance. Before the test, you know which ones are going to pass and which ones are going to fail. You already know that. The goal is to demonstrate to the student the areas of improvement or mastery. So let's start with the first lens. God had issued a single command to the humans. You may freely eat of any tree of the garden, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and bad you shall not eat. for in the day that you eat of it, you shall die. If it is true that God is a God of order rather than chaos, this command must make sense. Unfortunately, it is often just taken to be a case of God setting down some law to see whether humans would obey it or not. However, that would mean that this single command issued to the humans was just some arbitrary command. In other words, God could have issued any command. He could have told them, for example, you shall eat figs only on Wednesday. That's a command. Or, you must face northwards only on Thursdays. You must drink from the Gihon and Pishon on alternate days. These are all commands. And they could be very well worth testing, if that was all what God was trying to do. If the command is arbitrary, then any command will do. But this would make God out to be doing things quite randomly rather than having a purpose. Now, when I say God has a purpose, it does not mean I'm saying God has a plan. Many of you all have problems with these kind of things, yeah? Purpose and plans are two different things. I say purpose, okay? Anyway. Hence, it is not enough for us simply to say that the prohibition from eating that particular fruit had no reason other than that God simply felt like it. It's not that, oh, there's a tree, let me prohibit humans from eating that. We must therefore dive into the text of the Bible, but not just this text. We need to ask ourselves, what kind of relationship does God intend to have with his human creatures? And here we see that Jesus makes it very clear God's intention is to share meals with his people. Okay? Hence, in the letter to the church in Laodicea, Jesus says, I am standing at the door, knocking. If you hear my voice and open the door, I will come in and eat with you, and you with me. Every church celebrates and observes an ordinance or sacrament we call the Lord's Supper, or Eucharist, or communion, in which we remember a meal Jesus shared with his disciples. We have to understand that sharing meals is one of the most meaningful ways of saying we are one family. Hence, for God to intend to share meals with us is an expression of his desire to include us in his family. But if we see this as a goal, showing up later in the promises of Revelation, should we not expect it to be there right from the start? But think of this. I have a good friend who is allergic to milk products. When we go out to eat, she doesn't order anything with milk products in them. I, on the other hand, not having any allergies, go ahead and order dishes with cream and cheese and all that without any reservations. What I'm eating would be quite dangerous, potentially life-threatening to her, but we can still share a meal. In other words, we can easily think of a situation where two people share a meal without actually sharing the food. It is the company that you're keeping that matters, not the food that you're eating. If then it was God's desire to share meals with his human creatures, could the two trees represent the kinds of food each of them would consume? God could eat from both trees without facing any harm. However, the humans could only eat from the tree of life without permanent damage to themselves. Somehow, eating from the other tree would result in irreparable damage to the humans. In this case, the commandment is like a health warning to the humans rather than a test of obedience in itself. However, the warning provides an opportunity for the adversary to test the humans. When the humans disobey and eat the forbidden fruit, which they know is from the tree of the knowledge of good and bad, they conclude that consuming the fruit automatically gives them the nourishment promised by the fruit. The fruit could indeed give the knowledge of good and bad, but only to someone capable of digesting the fruit. To a person who could not digest its contents, it would do the opposite. Just like if my friend ate cheese with me, she would get painfully bloated without any nourishment actually reaching her body. In other words, after eating the fruit, the humans believed they had wisdom, when in fact they had become foolish, only thinking that they had gained wisdom by eating of the fruit. The result of the disobedience is that humans are under a grave deception that they are wise. Isn't that why we call ourselves Homo sapiens, which means the wise human? Though possessing no wisdom, we have convinced ourselves that we are the wisest creature ever to have walked on this earth. The tree promised, through its name, that the eater would gain the knowledge of good and bad. But what does that mean? What is the knowledge of good and bad? Last Sunday, I insisted that we should translate the Hebrew word ra as bad rather than as evil, because I claimed that the issue was not about morality but wisdom. To have the knowledge of good and bad is to have the ability to decide the best course of action in any situation. Of course, if we had such an ability, our lives would essentially be risk-free, since we would know exactly what to do in every situation. This is the knowledge the tree promised, and this is the knowledge we sought and still seek. However, because no finite being can ever possess such knowledge, our eating of this fruit only convinced us that we had obtained this knowledge, while in reality, the fruit began to damage us from the inside out. When the man blamed the woman and the woman blamed the snake, both were attempting to artificially achieve what the tree promised, namely, reduce risk to themselves. Unfortunately, we still live with the delusion that we know what is best for us. Hence, whenever we gain some ability, we do not ask if we should proceed or not. The simple fact that something is possible provides us with the rationale for proceeding. And the result is we damage ourselves and the world we share with other creatures. Proverbs tells us, do not answer fools according to their folly, lest you be fools yourself. Hence, it is impossible to get humans to listen to reason and to backtrack their unwise decisions precisely because, in our foolishness, we think we are wise. The second scriptural lens of our rebellion is in Genesis 6. There in verse 5, we read, "The Lord saw the wickedness of the humans was great in the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of their hearts was only evil continually." If we were wondering what specifically was evil, the text does not leave us uninformed, for in verse 11 we read, "Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence." Indeed, the opening verses declare, when people began to multiply on the face of the ground, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that they were fair, and they took wives for themselves of all that they chose. The precursor to this is in Genesis chapter 4, where we read of Cain's descendant, Lamech, who kills a boy for causing a minor injury, and who then boasts about it to his two wives, the first recorded instance of polygamy, which inevitably leads to the exploitation of and violence against women. The opening verses of Genesis 6, along with the account concerning Lamech, tells us the kind of violence that was particularly troubling to God. In the case of Lamech, it is the use of overwhelming power to kill a weaker person in the context of the exploitation of women. Ironically, the same sort of violence surrounding the sons of God is described in the opening verses of Genesis 6. In case you are unconvinced that this is the main problem identified in the passage, we can see some parallels between Genesis 3 and Genesis 6. In Genesis 3, verse 6, we read, "When the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate." The same pattern is repeated in Genesis 6, 2, where we read, "The sons of God saw that they were fair, and they took wives for themselves of all that they chose." In both cases, we have a seeing of some object, the seeing of the fruit by the woman in Genesis 3, the seeing of the daughters of men by the sons of God in Genesis 6. This is followed by a recognition that this object is good. Indeed, in both passages, the humans involved see that the subject is tov, the Hebrew word for good. In Genesis 6, this is often translated as fair or beautiful, thereby obscuring what the text is actually saying, since the Hebrew has other words that could be used if you wanted to describe physical beauty or visible beauty. And then finally, this is followed by taking of the object. We see the same pattern in 2 Samuel chapter 11, in the incident where David violates Bathsheba. There, we see the same three words in action. David sees her, finds that she is beautiful, again, the Hebrew word tov, and takes her. This pattern, see something, evaluate it as good, and take it for yourself, is very common in the Old Testament in context of human sin. Hence, its presence here in Genesis 3 and 6 should indicate to us what God has really found objectionable. In Genesis 3, it was the humans taking and eating the forbidden fruit. In Genesis 6, it is the sons of God taking the daughters of men. Now, this is not a place to go into depth to Genesis 6. If you wish, you can hold your questions till after church. But what we can learn from Genesis 6 is that the principle of might makes right, where those in power, the sons of God, prey on those who are weak, the daughters of men, and ruthlessly violently dominate them, is found to be intolerable, leading to judgment. Later in chapter 10, we are introduced to Nimrod, who is celebrated for his violence. From Nimrod's account, we should understand that despite the devastation of the flood, which was unleashed against the humans because of their inclination towards violence, humans did not learn. They continued to celebrate precisely the kind of people whose practices God found objectionable enough to justify with the worldwide flood. The tendency of people in power to use their positions to exploit and violate other people is something we are all too familiar with. This was not evident in the account in Genesis 3 because the narrative had only two people, the woman and the man. However, now we have the development of large communities of people, which require some sort of organization. And with organization comes the drive towards establishing hierarchies, which consistently and constantly makes power accumulate in the hands of fewer and fewer people. These people, by virtue of having power, use it to enrich themselves and empower themselves at the expense of others, impoverishing and disempowering them without any reservations. When God created the heavens and the earth, we saw it was an act of service, however. Through creation, God reveals to us that he is not one to hoard power, but that he willingly steps aside to make room for his creatures. With the rebellion of Genesis 6, we see that human leaders had cast aside this divine disempowerment and had chosen the way of violent power. But there is a darker side to this rebellion. Genesis 6 reveals that we as a race decided to call these people heroes and warriors of renown. Despite the fact that they had used their power to violently violate other people, we used powerful and, in our minds, positive terms to describe them, revealing that we had discarded God as our model and had chosen these violent men as our models. Bear this in mind. The only reason we call people like Cyrus of Persia, Ashoka of Maurya, Alexander of Macedon, Frederick of Prussia, Peter of Russia, and others like them great is because we secretly desire to have the power that they do so that we can wield the power in the way they did. Genesis 6 reveals that we will gladly be subservient to a powerful and violent person than reject the model that person presents and oppose that person by adopting the model we find from God in Genesis 1 and 2. Otherwise, we would not use the moniker great for these people. The third scriptural lens is Genesis 11. The human inclination for violence continues until we get to this account, where we read, "Now the whole earth had one language and the same words." Do you not find this strange? I mean, many of us use the same language. Right now I'm using English. Presumably you all can understand what I'm saying. However, Genesis 11 tells us that the people not only spoke the same language, they spoke the same words. But when do you find people saying the same things? If someone else had preached on today's theme, he or she would likely have had a different perspective than I do. He or she would have used different vocabulary to communicate the ideas he or she thought were important. And even if there was some overlap with my ideas, he or she would have communicated those ideas in different ways, with different words and different examples. But what Genesis tells us is the whole earth had one language and the same words. In what circumstances is such a thing even possible? This is only possible under a fascist and totalitarian regime, one in which no differing views than the official propaganda are permitted to be expressed. This is a situation in which a so-called unity is achieved through the enforcement of uniformity. Hence, we read that rather than spreading throughout the whole earth as God intended, they gathered in one place in an attempt at severe centralization. In addition, there was only one language indicating one mode of communication. And finally, the declaration that they spoke the same words points to extreme indoctrination and propaganda required for any fascist and totalitarian regime to survive. Such regimes almost always defend their legitimacy by insisting that they have a close relationship with a higher power. In Genesis 11, they named the city Babel, or Gate of the God. And the tower they built is most likely a ziggurat, because that was what they built in those days. There are many examples in Western Asia. It's a structure with a square base, gigantic steps, so it's concentric square bases all tapering up to a top square. The ziggurat symbolized steps that the deity would use to come down to reside in the temple that would have been constructed near the ziggurat. Hence, the people of Babel claimed that they had special access to the gods. Because of this special access, they insisted that everyone adopt the official line on everything. After all, if this is where the God comes down to earth, then this is where the only truth resides. And if this is the source of the only truth, then everyone is expected to repeat that truth without reservation. It is only in this way that the narrator could tell us that not only they spoke the same language, but also that they spoke the same words. Repetition of the prevailing dogmas was expected, and the people had no recourse but to fall in line. So what we have seen from these three scriptural lenses is that after eating the forbidden fruit, humans began to believe that they possess what the fruit provides. But because we cannot digest its nutrients, we only have a false sense of possessing wisdom. This illusion of wisdom leads us down the path where we start celebrating violence and even institutionalize it. The result of this is a fascist and totalitarian society in which no dissenting voices are permitted. Here it pays to understand why fascist and totalitarian regimes operate in this way and how they manage to convince so many to accept their totalitarian perspective. They do not see themselves as suppressors of opposition. Rather, they see themselves as the only purveyors of truth, concluding that those who oppose them are incorrect and purveyors of falsehood. But more than that, they view things as a battle between good and evil. This Manichaean approach, seeing everything through the lens of a battle between good and evil, sets people up to be intolerant to other perspectives and adversarial towards those who have different views. They start thinking of themselves as the only defenders of the truth who have been subjugated by the proponents of evil. When you have accepted such a view of the world and your place in it, you are prime fodder for those who have totalitarian ambitions and who desire to wield power and hold on to it by any means. Suppression of dissent then becomes a holy vocation in the service of God you have decided to worship. Attacking, even with violence, those who dissent becomes a crusade to be waged in defense of the truth. Perhaps we can understand a lot of the things that are going around in this world today especially in places where dissent is criminalized. We can also understand why people use violence to enforce their perspectives. These, then, are the three ways in which humans have rebelled against God. It is crucial to note that in all three episodes, there is evidence of the involvement of the members of the unseen realm in the decisions that the humans made. In Genesis chapter 3, the snake appears. While the text does not immediately identify anything special about the snake, Revelation identifies the snake with the dragon and Satan. In Genesis 6, the term sons of God has a dual reference. I have focused on the meaning referring to violent rulers. However, it could also refer to the divine council, as it does in Psalm 82, Psalm 89, and Job chapters 1 and 2. In Genesis 11, since Yahweh has to make the effort to come down to see what the humans were doing, it is clear that he was not consulted about the construction of the ziggurat. However, the people at Babel somehow knew that they had to make a structure with these steps for some entity. Which entity? To descend from the heavens to the earth. The involvement of the members of the unseen realm in all three events indicates how serious the problem was. It was not limited to humans. Rather, humans had been co-opted into an ongoing rebellion in the unseen realm. It is also crucial to note that underlying the human co-option into rebellion of the unseen realm lies our acceptance of a new model, a model of scarcity. Whereas the first recorded words of God to a human are, "You may eat freely of every tree in the garden," the serpent comes with the question, did God say, "You shall not eat from any tree in the garden," thereby highlighting the one thing they were supposed to stay away from? Similarly, the pattern see, evaluate, take that we see in Genesis 3 and 6 is based on a scarcity mindset. Finally, the idea of building a gate of the God reveals a desire to limit access to the God in one location where they had decided to build. Whereas God had sanctified every period, every place, every practice, every person, as we saw last time, the people at Babel insisted on something different. Since the ziggurat would have to be built near a temple, the construction of the ziggurat indicated a turning back, or rather a turning now first, to special periods, special places, special practices, and special people. Humans had turned their back on the model God had been to them and had accepted a rival model. What was God going to do? This gets us to the immediate divine responses in each of the three cases we have looked at. In Genesis 3, we read, "Then Yahweh God said, 'See, the humans have become like one of us, knowing good and bad. And now they may reach out their hands and also take of the tree of life and eat and live forever.' Therefore the Lord God sent them forth from the Garden of Eden to till the ground from where they were taken." From my air quotes, you can see that I interpret the first part, where God says that the humans know good and bad, as a sarcastic statement to contrast what humans think they have achieved and what is actually the case. Given that the humans had caused themselves irreversible damage by eating something they could not digest, causing them to be placed under an illusion that they had already actually received what the fruit provided, the humans were in a particularly vulnerable state. If they ate from the tree of life now, they would live forever in the state of delusion. Hence, the divine judgment of banishing them from the garden is actually a sign of mercy on the humans, not an example of retributive justice. Now, the humans no longer had access to the tree of life and became subject to their mortality. Hence, in Genesis 5, we repeatedly read about people living a certain number of years, and then he died, and then he died, and then he died. Humans remain without wisdom and are now subject to death. If God has to solve the human predicament, He has to somehow infuse humans with wisdom and get them to a point where eating from the tree of life would not be a recipe for disaster. Keep this in mind because we are now uncovering the roots of our problem. We are realizing the exact nature of the problems God has to solve if He has to fix what is wrong with us. When we come to Genesis 6, the divine judgment is that of unleashing the flood. Since, according to the account, the flood covers the whole world, theologically speaking, this is a universal judgment against evil that God had identified. Note that it was violence. Hence, the flood was intended to put an end to the human inclination towards violence, and especially in the context of Genesis 4 and Genesis 6, violence against women. The 8 occupants of the ark were supposed to form a new humanity, possessing knowledge that God had found human violence and exploitation worthy of universal judgment. Hence, following the flood, God makes the only covenant in the Bible that includes every part of creation along with humans. With a covenant made not just with humans, but with every other life form on the earth, the intention is to tell humans that they may not exploit and violate other parts of creation, let alone other humans. However, it is in the very next chapter itself that we read about Nimrod, who is celebrated for his violence. And it is under his command that the ancient cities of Babel, Erech, Akkad, Calneh, Nineveh, Rehoboth-ir, Calah, and Resen are built. Babylon and Nineveh will play an enormous role in the history of the Israelites. Come back 2 Sundays later. Being the capitals of 2 empires under which the Israelites were dispersed into exile. Hence, Nimrod, as the founder of these cities, serves to show that human violence has still not been dealt with. Humans still lack wisdom, and they still adopt as their role models individuals who are willing to violently violate other humans. Despite the clear fact that violent people will eventually violate everyone, as can be seen from numerous examples from the past and unfortunately many, many cruel people today, humans still insist on taking such individuals as their role models. If the flood judgment is explicitly against human violence and exploitation, the judgment of Genesis 11 is against the fruit of human violence and exploitation. The scattering of the humans with the subsequent rise of different languages is intended so that there would not be one language to unite all humans and take them down the path of destruction. Further, the confusion caused at Babel forces the humans to spread through the earth, thereby undermining their centralizing efforts. The possibility of differing voices now, literally through the variety of languages, is supposed to protect against the human inclination towards totalitarian thinking. Of course, we can see that none of the problems have been solved. Though we are fools, we still think we are wise, thereby blinding us to the errors of our ways until it is too late. When we get power, we almost always use it to assert our preferences and subjugate those who disagree with us, even if it means resorting to violence. And if we get sufficient power, we almost always use it to silence those who have differing perspectives than we do, because we are convinced we are engaged in a battle between good and evil. Most often, this appears as violence against a person or minority that is viewed as being a source of the evil. The totalitarian impulse is fulfilled in the collective violence of societies against its scapegoats. This led René Girard to write, quote, "There is no culture without a tomb, and no tomb without a culture. In the end, the tomb is the first and only cultural symbol. The above-ground tomb does not have to be invented. It is the pile of stones in which the victim of the unanimous stoning is buried. It is the first pyramid," unquote. Incidentally, the ziggurat also has roughly the same shape. However, If humans are to be qualified to enter the new creation, they need to be able to have wisdom, or they themselves will prove to be the wrench in the works. Humans also need to be able to handle power when they are entrusted with it, or they will once again adopt ways of violence. And humans need to be able to handle differing perspectives on how to resolve situations, or they will attempt to silence and suppress others who disagree with them. All of this needs to be accomplished before God can bring us into the new creation. And you thought God only had to deal with your anger and your greed and your covetousness. For the most part, the church has failed to see the enormity of the problem we face prior to Abraham's call, which we will deal with next week. We have not understood the full thrust of the first 11 chapters of Genesis. We have flattened it to an issue of disobedience to a command rather than the more important issues related to the formation of our character, namely our relation to wisdom, our relation to violence, and our relation to difference. On account of this, we have a stunted view of the problem that God had to solve, and that he did solve in and through and as Jesus. But this means that we have a faulty understanding of what our predicament is and was. We have an infantile understanding of what it means for God to save us. Hence, we have a limited understanding of soteriology, that is the doctrine of salvation itself. But now we have learned something different. We have seen that our problem does not stem from a single episode. Rather, the problem we have stems from this entire stream developed through a pernicious and sustained rebellion. And salvation involves making us fit to inherit the new creation, thereby undoing the effects of the sustained rebellion. Let us pray. Gracious Father, what a downer. Father, I pray that you would somehow allow the despair of this message to make us yearn for something brighter. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.